Alright, okay, so let's get started. So just before we start, so what we're going to be doing today is just go through some questions that might turn up for the KDU aptitude test. So we are going to focus on biology, but keep in mind that chemistry as well as physics questions and maths questions will turn up for the exam on the 11th of August. And so these are just for practice, some of the topics that might turn up for the exam. So what you can do, you can also be, after this session, you can look for similar questions and practice for yourselves as well. Okay, so these are not questions that have come up for the exam previously, so these are some questions that I made by myself, but similar questions might turn up. Alright, okay, so we'll start with the first few questions, and I would like you guys also to get involved in this and answer as many questions as you can, so as we go on, so we can make this a discussion among the people that are currently available for the live discussion. Okay, so I expect you guys to give out answers as well. Okay, right, now for the first question, which structure in the human brain regulates body temperature? So we have cerebellum, medulla oblongata, cerebrum, and the hypothalamus. So what do you think is the right answer here? Any idea? Okay, so the hypothalamus is the correct answer here. So this hypothalamus is the part of the human brain that regulates body temperature in this case. Okay, what is the primary role of the alveoli in the lungs? Is it to prevent food from entering the lungs, transport oxygen in the blood, exchange gases between air and blood, or to warm and moisten incoming air? So it's to exchange gases between air and blood. Okay, so we want an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide found in the body is released outside to the outside atmosphere, and the oxygen is taken in to then get exchanged into the blood. Okay, so the alveoli is where this exchange takes place. To prevent food from entering the lungs, we have what we call an epiglottis. So that would have been the answer for that question. Okay, so every time we ingest food from the mouth, how does it go straight into the esophagus? The epiglottis closes the windpipe, so essentially your trachea and your airway essentially. So the food, everything passes into the esophagus and then into the stomach. Transport oxygen in the blood, that would be hemoglobin found within the red blood cells, okay, or what we call the erythrocytes. And warm and moisten incoming air, that's part of the trachea. So we have the trachea, the nose itself. So we have a lot of cells within the respiratory system. Those will help to warm and moisten the incoming air. Now going to the next question, which blood vessel carries the oxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs? So we have aorta, pulmonary vein, pulmonary artery, and vena cava. So this is the oxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. So now the heart is divided into 4 chambers. We have the atrium, we have the ventricles. So we have the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the right atrium, the right ventricle. So the right side, right atrium, right ventricle are the ones that carry the oxygenated blood, So once the blood from the systemic circulation comes into the right atria, from the right atria will move to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle it will then move on to the lungs where it gets oxygenated, and then it turns into the left atrium and finally into the left ventricle. Okay, so that's the system of the blood across the heart. Okay, so in this case then the oxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs will be the pulmonary artery. So the right ventricle will contract and push blood into the pulmonary artery, which then will reach the lungs. Which part of the nephron is primarily responsible for the selective reabsorption of glucose? So we have the Bowman capsule, loop of Henle, proximal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. So the right answer is the proximal convoluted tubule. So we have an exchange between glucose and sodium. So glucose, so it's not a reabsorption, it's actually a synergy where both glucose and sodium are reabsorbed into the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule. The hormone insulin is produced by which cells of the pancreas? Alpha cells, beta cells, acina cells, or delta cells? So out of here, the alpha cells are responsible for the production of glucagon. Beta cells is the correct answer. So beta cells is what produces insulin, and delta cells are also found in the pancreas. They produce what we call somatostatin. Okay. Acina cells also found there, but those are responsible not for the endocrine function of the pancreas, but more for the exocrine function of the pancreas, where they release a lot of enzymes. Okay, there are more questions on the pancreas, so we'll talk about the acina cells and the exocrine function of the pancreas later on. Which component of blood is responsible for initiating clotting? Erythrocytes, which are our red blood cells, platelets, lymphocytes, or plasma? So it will be platelets. Platelets the right answer in this question. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the chat box, and you can ask your questions there. Okay. Sorry, I might have missed some of your questions if you have used the chat. So if you have asked anything, just copy and paste your questions once again into the chat, so I'll be able to see them now. Okay. So yeah, question 6, the component responsible for initiating clotting is platelets. Okay. Number 7, which organ regulates the amount of water reabsorbed in the kidneys by releasing ADH? Liver, pituitary gland, hypothalamus, or adrenal gland? So the right answer is pituitary gland. Okay, so we have the anterior pituitary gland, posterior part of the pituitary gland. So ADH is released by the posterior part of the pituitary gland. So ADH is released and it acts within the collecting duct of the kidneys in order to reabsorb water. So the more ADH you have, the more water is reabsorbed by the kidneys. What is the primary function of the small intestine? Is it to absorb nutrients, absorb water, break down proteins, or for the production of bile? So the small intestine, it's responsible for the absorption of nutrients. The absorption of water happens by the large intestine. Okay. Which of the following is a function of the liver? Produces insulin, filters nitrogenous waste, stores bile, detoxifies harmful substances. So the correct answer for this question is detoxifies harmful substances. Okay. It doesn't store bile. Bile is stored in the organ we call the gallbladder. Okay. Filters nitrogenous waste is done by the kidneys, and production of insulin, as we saw earlier, is done by the beta cells of the pancreas. Which hormone stimulates the release of an egg during ovulation? Is it progesterone, estrogen, progesterone, LH, which is luteinizing hormone, FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. So the correct answer is LH, luteinizing hormone. So we have a huge increase in the release of LH, which causes the egg to be released during ovulation. Which cells in the immune system produce antibodies? T helper cells, cytotoxic T cells, B lymphocytes, and macrophages. So it will be your T lymphocytes. Those are the ones responsible for the production of antibodies. What is the main function of hemoglobin? Fight infections, transport oxygen, clot blood, or digest proteins. So it's to transport oxygen. It's not to fight infections. To fight infections, we have the lymphocytes, we have T cells, and we have B cells, right? We have macrophages. So those are the ones responsible to fight infections. Hemoglobin transports oxygen within the red blood cells. To clot blood, we saw platelets are clotting the blood. And to digest proteins, we have enzymes. Okay, so hemoglobin is not an enzyme. It's part of protein of the red blood cells for the transportation of oxygen. Which structure in the heart prevents backflow of blood from ventricles to atria? Semilunar valves, aortic valve, pulmonary valve, or the atrioventricular valve? So anyone has any clue for this answer? Let's get some of you to answer as well. Yeah, so I just realized that you're not able to see questions. So 1 second, just give me 1 second. Let me try to fix this. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see the screen now. Is that the case? Can you guys see the screen now? Okay, so I think you should be able to see it. So we'll continue from here, and if there's any issue, let me know. Okay. All right. So question 14: which structure in the heart prevents backflow of blood from ventricles to the atria? So we have the semilunar valves, aortic valve, pulmonary valve, and the atrioventricular valves. So the correct answer here is atrioventricular valves. Okay, so between the atria and the ventricles, as you may remember, we have the atrioventricular valves. The semilunar valves are found okay, before that, now from the ventricles we have the pulmonary artery, and we have the aorta from the left ventricle, right? So those are what we call the pulmonary valves and the aortic valves, which are also known to be semilunar valves. Okay, so the semilunar valves here are basically the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve, and the atrioventricular valves are the ones between the atria and the ventricles. So to prevent the backflow, when the ventricles contract, to allow the blood to be pushed into the pulmonary artery or into the aortic artery, into the aorta, the atrioventricular valve will shut down and prevent the backflow into the atria. The myelin sheath of a neuron increases the strength of a nerve impulse, the diameter of the axon, the speed of the nerve impulse conduction, or the production of neurotransmitters. So the myelin sheath will increase the speed of nerve impulse conduction. So if you can remember from your A-level days, we have something called the saltatory conduction, which basically causes the action potential, because the action potential is what navigates across the neuron. The action potential will basically jump from one myelin sheath to the next, right? So the spaces, the gaps in between the myelin sheaths, essentially. So that's what we call saltatory conduction. So saltatory conduction is important to increase the speed of conduction. What is the role of the loop of Henle in the nephron? Is it to absorb glucose, to filtrate blood, reabsorption of water and salts, or is it to store urine? So loop of Henle is important for the reabsorption of water and salts. So we are trying to concentrate the urine. We want to keep as much water as we can inside the body, and as much salts as well. So the process of concentration of urine happens within the loop of Henle. Absorption of glucose, as we saw earlier, happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. Filtration of blood, that happens at the Bowman capsule. And storage of urine, so that usually happens in the bladder, right? So nothing to do with the nephron. What happens during muscle contraction at the molecular level? ATP breaks actin-myosin cross bridges. Calcium ions inhibit actin. Actin pulls on myosin, or myosin slides over actin filaments. So the muscle contraction happens when myosin slides over the actin filaments. Actin is the one that remains stationary, and the myosin will keep on sliding. They have small heads, right? The heads will bind to actin, and it will cause the muscle contraction. So if you can't remember on any of these topics, I would suggest go back and revise these topics, right? Because these are the sort of questions that they will ask for your aptitude test. Obviously, there will be some chemistry, some physics also, but because you're going to be studying medicine, obviously it will be heavily focused on human biology. Forget about plants and ecosystems, biodiversity, those things will not come up in your exam, but it will be mainly human biology questions. Which part of the eye controls the amount of light entering? Is it the retina, lens, iris, or the cornea? So the right answer is iris. Iris is the part that will contract and will allow the control of the amount of light entering the eye. If it contracts, less light will go in. If it dilates, then it will allow more light to come in. So it will contract, especially when you're looking at something with a lot of light. So for example, if you're looking directly at the sun, or if you're looking directly at the sun, the iris will contract. So it will reduce the amount of light entering your eye. If you're like in the dark, if you have noticed, sometimes when you look at something in the dark, at first you're not able to see it properly. So after a few seconds you're able to see it because the iris are now dilating and allow more light into the eye. So then you're able to see more things in detail during the night because now more light is going inside your eye. What is the correct order of events in the reflex arc? Effector, sensory neuron, receptor, relay neuron, motor neuron. So I think you guys can read this, right? So in the sensory reflex arc is that stimulatory effect that happens when usually this mechanism is shown in books where if you were to touch a candle, a lighted candle, if you were to touch the fire, that response that you get in the pain, how is it that you're getting that pain, and what is that effect, the sequential of events that happens in order for you to take your hand away from the fire. Okay, so let's have a look at the correct answer here. Okay, so it would be B, which is receptor, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, and the effector. So the receptors are the ones that are found in your fingertips. Now imagine that you have your finger and you place it right into the fire. So the receptors will get activated because the fire will stimulate the receptors in your finger. So now you have your sensory neuron, which is traveling all the way and to your spinal cord, and in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron you'll find the relay neuron. So within your spinal cord you'll find the relay neurons that connect the sensory to the motor, and the motor neuron will then be connected to the effector, which will be your muscles. So the muscles of the arm, which are now stimulated to move the hand away from the fire. So I hope that makes sense, right? So it's always sensory first. You have to sense, you have to be able to basically sense that there is something going on there, and then the motor neuron will be activated to allow the muscles to respond. Next question, what type of muscle is found in the walls of the intestine? Is it skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or voluntary muscle? Okay, there is nothing called voluntary muscle. Okay, so you could essentially say the voluntary muscle is the skeletal muscle because that's the muscle that we are able to control. And then we have smooth muscles, which are muscles that we perceptionally we are not able to control. And then the cardiac muscle, which is the muscle found in the heart. So again, that's another type of involuntary muscle that we are not able to control. So the muscles that make the walls of the intestine will have to be an involuntary muscle, something that we are not able to contract. So it has to be either B or C. So obviously it cannot be C because that's part of the heart. So it will be smooth muscle that make up the walls of the intestine. What is the function of the surfactant in the lungs? So is it to reduce surface tension in alveoli, to increase blood flow to alveoli, to trap dust and pathogens, or is it to facilitate active transport of oxygen? So the surfactant is used to reduce surface tension in the alveoli. So as you may recollect, the alveoli are very prone to collapse. So in order to prevent them from collapsing, the body produces surfactant. So there are types of cells which called the type 2 pneumocytes within the alveoli. They produce the surfactant, which is essentially almost like a small liquid that surrounds the wall of the alveoli and therefore reduce the surface tension in the alveoli in order to prevent the alveoli from collapsing. So which part of the brain controls breathing rate? Is it the cerebellum, hypothalamus, medulla oblongata, or the cerebrum? So it will be the medulla oblongata. Okay, so that's the part of the brain that controls the breathing rate. Okay, so out of this, the cerebellum is what controls coordination and movement. Hypothalamus, we saw it earlier, right, controls temperature. Medulla oblongata now in this case for the breathing rate, and the cerebrum, which is important for all the high functions of the brain. Okay, what is the primary function of red blood cells? Defend against pathogens, transport hormones, transport oxygen, or is it to regulate blood pH? So I think we saw this earlier, right? So it's to transport oxygen. What part of the red blood cells control the transportation of oxygen is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is found within red blood cells, and it's used for the transportation of oxygen. Which chamber of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs? Is it the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, or left ventricle? So now we are talking about oxygenated blood from the lungs. So we are talking about the left side of the heart. So it's either left atrium or the left ventricle. So the lungs are directly connected to the left atrium. So that's the first chamber that will receive blood anyway, right? So from the lungs to the atrium, we have the pulmonary veins. So that's one thing for you guys to remember. Usually the heart, when it pumps blood into the system, into our systemic circulation, it does that into the aorta. The aorta is an artery, while it receives the oxygenated blood from the vena cava, which is a vein. Right? We have the superior vena cava, we have the inferior vena cava. Those go into the right atrium. But the difference here is that when the heart contracts and pushes the oxygenated blood into the lungs, it does that through the pulmonary artery, while the oxygenated blood comes back into the heart through pulmonary veins. Okay, so we have a small difference here compared to the systemic circulation. Oxygenated blood in the systemic circulation is found sorry about that. right. So yeah, okay. So so 1 second. Okay, so we were talking about the systemic circulation, and yeah, so all the oxygenated blood will be found um, within the arteries, and the deoxygenated blood will be found in the right. Okay, sorry about that. So let's move on. So which process removes nitrogenous waste from the blood? So we have secretion, filtration, absorption, and detoxification. So the nitrogenous waste from the blood. Okay, so the process that removes nitrogenous waste from the blood is filtration. Okay, so filtration is what happens at the level of the kidneys. So all the blood that passes through the kidneys then will get filtered. Which component of blood carries antibodies? We have red blood cells, platelets, plasma, and white blood cells. So which component of blood carries antibodies will be the white blood, the plasma cells. Okay, white blood cells produce them. Plasma cells are the ones that carry the antibodies. In thermoregulation, which response occurs when body is too cold? We have vasodilation, sweating, shivering, and increased blood flow to skin. So shivering is the right answer here. The muscles are basically contracting, and when the muscles contract, it creates friction, and as out of friction, heat is generated. Okay, so shivering is the right answer here. Which part of the brain stores learned motor skills and coordinates movement? So that's something that we have already seen. So the answer here is the cerebellum. Okay, coordination, movement, everything comes from the cerebellum. What happens to the diaphragm during inhalation? So now when we inhalate, the diaphragm is essentially contracting. So your chest has to create more space for the lungs to expand. So the diaphragm is contracting and it's moving downwards. Okay, so this is the right answer here. Which hormone controls the metabolic rate of the body? Insulin, cortisol, thyroxine, or glucagon? So thyroxine is the right answer. Okay, so everything metabolically related is the right answer, will always be thyroxine. Where in the nephron does ultrafiltration occur? So we have seen this question before as well. The right answer is Bowman capsule. Which component of the nervous system prepares the body for fight or flight response? So that's the sympathetic system. Which blood group is the universal donor? We have A, B, A, B, O. So O is the universal donor. So just a little bit background here. Now when we talk about universal donor, we want something that is not going, when you're giving it to someone else, is not going to create a reaction. So the reason why O is not giving that reaction is because the red blood cells have what we call antigens. So these cells, the people with blood group O, they don't have these antigens on their red blood cells. So they don't get detected when this blood is given to someone else. Okay, so that's why we name O as the universal donor. The hormone oxytocin is involved in growth of follicles, regulation of metabolism, contraction of uterus during childbirth, and milk production. So oxytocin is important for the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. Okay, so remember that. What causes the lub-dub sound of the heart is the opening of the valves, blood entering the atria, contraction of atria, or closure of the heart valves. So it's the closure of the heart valves that creates the lub-dub sound. Okay, so the heart has two sounds. The first one is lub, the second one is dub. Both of these sounds happen when the atrioventricular valves, the valves between the atria and the ventricles, are shutting down. So when the ventricles are contracting to push blood into the pulmonary artery or into the aorta, these valves have to close. When they close, it creates these sounds. Okay, so that's the first sound. And then the second sound, dub sound, is created by the closure of the semilunar valves. The P wave on an ECG represents ventricular contraction, atrial contraction, ventricular repolarization, or atrial repolarization. Okay, so the P wave on the ECG represents atrial contraction. Sorry, not atrial contraction, atrial repolarization. Okay, then which hormone promotes water reabsorption in the kidneys? So we saw this question earlier as well. Is the ADH, which is released from the posterior pituitary gland and acts on the collecting ducts, allowing water to be reabsorbed. Which enzyme begins digestion of carbohydrates in the mouth? So we have amylase, lipase, pepsin, and maltase. So the right answer is amylase. Okay, amylase is responsible for the digestion of carbohydrates. Lipase is for lipids, for fats, and pepsin for proteins. So forget about maltase. These are the three ones that you need to remember. Okay. Where is the sinoatrial node located? So it will be the right atrium. Okay, sinoatrial node is important for the initiation of the contraction of the heart. It releases impulses that spreads through the heart and allow the contraction of the atria and the ventricles. What is the function of cilia in the trachea? So absorption of oxygen, filter out carbon dioxide, move mucus upward, or for the dilation of bronchioles. So cilia in the trachea basically move mucus upwards. So any mucus that is found in the trachea that might have dust or other particles has to be excreted. So the cilia are basically moving all of this mucus upwards, which then you're basically able to secrete out. Which blood vessels are the site of nutrient and gas exchange with tissue? Arteries, veins, capillaries, or arterioles. So it's the capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest essentially blood vessels that allow this exchange to take place. What structure prevents food from entering the trachea? Is the epiglottis. We saw that earlier. I think that was the first question, if I'm not wrong. How does carbon dioxide primarily travel in the blood? Dissolved in the plasma as carbonic acid, bound to hemoglobin, or as bicarbonate ions. So the right answer is as carbonic acid. Which hormone increases heart rate and blood pressure? adrenaline, insulin, aldosterone, or thyroxine. So we saw the thyroxine is for metabolic functions, insulin is for diabetes, aldosterone is important for primarily other functions, including blood pressure control. But in this case, adrenaline is the right answer for increase of the heart rate as well as blood pressure. Which part of the nephron is mainly responsible for concentrating urine? So we saw this one earlier as well. Is the loop of Henle. Which organ produces digestive enzymes and insulin? So it's the pancreas, right? We discussed this already. So the pancreas, the exocrine function of the pancreas essentially for the digestive enzymes, and for insulin is the endocrine function. What is the main function of the spleen in the circulatory system? Filter digestive enzymes, store glucose, destroy all red blood cells, produce bile. So it's to destroy all red blood cells. Okay. Store glucose is done by the liver and the muscles. Produce bile is done by the liver. Filter digestive enzymes, I'm not sure. Okay, so destroy all red blood cells is part of the spleen's function. So which process moves food through the digestive system by muscle contraction? So it's peristalsis. Okay, so peristalsis is the function that where basically the muscles are contracting and allow the food to move slowly through the digestive system, through the small intestine, large intestine. What triggers the production of red blood cells? Insulin, erythropoietin, ADH, or thyroxine is erythropoietin. Where does fertilization usually occur in the female reproductive tract? So that happens within the uterine tube, the fallopian tube. Okay, so the ovary will release the eggs into the uterine tube, and at the same time we have the sperms that are now navigating themselves through the vagina and the uterus, and they will eventually meet at the uterine tube, the fallopian tube, where fertilization will occur. What are the functional units of the liver called? Nephrons, lobules, alveoli, glomeruli. So it will be the lobules. Okay, so liver is made by tons of these lobules that eventually lead to the formation of the lobes of the liver. We have left and right lobes. So these are all essential functional units of different organs. Okay, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, lobules for the liver, alveoli of the lungs. Glomeruli, not so much. They're essentially found within the kidney, but nephrons are the ones that are important here. Which digestive enzyme is activated by acid in the stomach? Which digestive enzyme is activated by acid in the stomach? Okay, so we have lipase, amylase, trypsinogen, and pepsin. So the right answer is pepsinogen. So pepsinogen is converted into pepsin in the stomach. What is the role of lymphatic system in immunity? To transport oxygen to tissues, produce hormones, launch immune responses, and filter pathogens, or balance pH in blood. So the right answer is launch immune response and filter pathogens. Which hormone stimulates the development of male secondary sexual characteristics? So I think this is straightforward. It's testosterone. Okay. What is the innermost layer of the heart wall called? The innermost layer is the endocardium. So if we look at all of these layers, from the innermost to the outermost, we have the endocardium, myocardium, epicardium, and then finally the pericardium. Okay, endo, myo, epi, and then finally peri. Which organ stores excess glucose in the form of glycogen? So I mentioned couple of organs earlier that are used basically for the storage of glucose, which is liver and muscle. But so in this case, if we have to look at this question, the right answer would be liver. Okay, the liver is the one that usually stores excess amount of glucose as glycogen. What is the primary site of water absorption in the digestive system? So it will be the large intestine. Which type of receptor responds to stretching in the blood cells? We have nociceptors, thermoreceptors, baroreceptors, and chemoreceptors. So the right answer for that respond to stretching will be the baroreceptors. In which organ are both lymphocytes produced and matured? So we have thymus, spleen, bone marrow, and lymph nodes. So the right answer is bone marrow. What is the role of bile in digestion? So bile is produced by the liver. It's stored in the gallbladder and then released into the duodenum. The duodenum is part of the small intestine. There are three parts to the small intestine: duodenum, jejunum, ileum. So the bile is released into the duodenum. So it's enzyme that breaks down sugars, hormone for appetite suppression, emulsifies fats for easy digestion, or absorb proteins. So the right answer is emulsify fats for easier digestion. What is the main function of platelets? So we saw this question earlier. Initiates blood clotting. What is the brief electrical impulse that travels along a neuron called? So it's the action potential. Okay, we discussed this earlier with the saltatory conduction. Action potential is the electrical impulse. Which hormone increases blood calcium levels by stimulating bone resorption? Calcitonin, parathyroid hormone, insulin, thyroxine. So the right answer, parathyroid hormone. Okay. What is the primary cause of type 1 diabetes mellitus? Insulin resistance, autoimmune destruction of beta cells, excess glucagon production, or overproduction of insulin. So the right answer is autoimmune destruction of beta cells. Now between type 2 and type 1 diabetes, the main difference is type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. The beta cells that produce insulin are completely broken down, destroyed by your own immune system. In type 2, what happens is most likely that there is an insulin resistance. Okay, so if it was type 2, I would have gone for insulin resistance as the right answer. Which mechanism maintains a constant internal environment in the body? Homeostasis, metabolism, osmosis, or diffusion? So homeostasis is the right answer. Okay, so I think that's one very straightforward question from your A-levels. Homeostasis is essentially what controls everything within your body, keeps everything at a constant level. Okay, so these are the questions that I had to discuss with you guys. Okay, so you can find a lot of these questions online as well for you guys to practice. Keep in mind, it's going to be mainly human biology questions. So I spoke to some seniors and they mentioned that some of these questions, human biology related questions, can turn up for your aptitude test. So it would be a good option for you guys to go and practice some of this stuff. Okay, keep in mind from the practice aptitude questions that you might have seen, there are also some arithmetic questions, algebra questions, uh, chemistry and physics not so much, but possibilities there, but heavily focused on some human biology questions as well. Okay, so there won't be that many questions, but at least keep in mind that 2 or 3 questions on biology can make a huge difference. So you're essentially preparing yourself to answer those because it's a general knowledge paper, so there will be other questions as well based on general knowledge, but some of these questions may turn up there since you're doing a medicine related aptitude test. Okay, so I see no one has raised any questions, so feel free to drop any questions in the comment section or in the group, and I'll be able to answer those for you. Okay, so with that said, if no one has any questions, I think we can conclude today's session here. Thank you for attending.